Alicia Carter was supposed to be on a routine business trip, first-class seat, smooth takeoff, nothing out of the ordinary. But the moment she stepped into the airport, everything changed. A random security check turned into something much worse. Unwarranted suspicion, humiliation, power plays disguised as protocol. They delayed her, questioned her, and treated her like she didn't belong. But what they didn't know was who they were dealing with. What started as an abuse of power would soon unravel into a confrontation they never expected, one that would shake the entire system. By the time Alicia finally took her seat on that plane, the people who had tried to stop her would realize their mistake too late. This is the story of a battle at 30,000 feet, one woman against an entire system. Stay until the end, because this one will leave you speechless. And before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Alicia Carter walked through the bustling terminal of JFK Airport, her heels clicking against the polished floors. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag and approached the check-in counter. She handed her passport and boarding pass to the airline agent, a young woman with tired eyes and a forced smile. The agent scanned Alicia's documents, then hesitated. Her gaze flickered between Alicia and the screen in front of her. "Step aside for a moment, please," the agent said. Alicia frowned. "Is there a problem?" "Routine security screening," the agent replied, but there was no warmth in her voice. Alicia had traveled enough to recognize the pattern. She turned her head slightly, observing the passengers ahead of her, most of them white, moving through without issue. A man with an overstuffed duffel bag, metal clanking inside, was waved through after a quick glance. A woman with an oversized coat, pockets bulging, breezed past. But Alicia Carter, dressed in a fitted navy blue suit, carrying nothing more than a handbag and a small carry-on, had been stopped. She sighed. "All right." A security officer approached. His name tag read Wells. He was stocky, with a stiff posture and a look of mild amusement on his face. "Ma'am, come with me." Alicia followed him to a separate inspection table. He gestured for her to place her bag down. "Remove your jacket, shoes, and belt," he instructed. Alicia complied, though irritation flared inside her. As she stood there in her blouse and dress pants, Wells unzipped her carry-on and began pulling out her belongings. A silk scarf, a leather wallet, a neatly folded blouse. He picked up her perfume bottle, turning it in his hands. Then he chuckled. "Didn't expect you to carry something this fancy," he muttered. Alicia's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" He shrugged. "Just saying. Surprised you can afford these brands." Alicia's hands curled into fists. "Are you implying something?" "Relax, ma'am. It's just an observation," Wells said, setting her belongings down carelessly. Before she could respond, another officer joined them, a younger man with sharp eyes. He held up Alicia's passport. "We need to verify some details," he said. Alicia exhaled sharply. "How long will that take?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he walked away with her passport. Wells folded his arms. "Might take a while. You sure you don't want to just book another flight?" Alicia held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No," she said. "I'll wait." She had no idea that this was just the beginning. Alicia stood motionless at the security checkpoint, watching the officer disappear with her passport. The air around her felt heavier, charged with an unspoken hostility. She had encountered subtle discrimination before the lingering stares, the patronizing tone, but this was different. This was blatant. She turned to Wells. "How long will this take?" He barely glanced at her. "As long as necessary." Alicia exhaled sharply. Her flight boarded in 30 minutes. She had a meeting scheduled as soon as she landed. Every second wasted here was another complication. A different officer, a woman this time, approached. Her badge read Harris. "Ma'am, come with me," she said briskly. Alicia hesitated. "Where are we going?" "Additional screening," Harris replied, already turning toward a corridor leading away from the main terminal. Alicia clenched her jaw. Is there a reason for this? Harris didn't slow down. Routine protocol. There was that phrase again. Routine. But Alicia had seen at least a dozen passengers pass through security with far bulkier bags and far less scrutiny. She followed Harris down the corridor, away from the bustling crowd. The walls narrowed, and soon they reached a small, windowless room. A single metal chair sat in the middle, next to a table covered in a thin, white cloth. The room felt deliberately cold, the fluorescent lighting casting a sterile glow. Sit down, Harris instructed. Alicia remained standing. What exactly are you looking for? Harris sighed as if dealing with an impatient child. Ma'am, we need to confirm some details about your identity. If you cooperate, this will go faster. Alicia crossed her arms. You already have my passport. What else do you need? Before Harris could answer, the door opened, and the officer from earlier returned. He still held Alicia's passport, but his expression had shifted. There's an issue, he announced. Alicia raised an eyebrow. An issue with what? Your identification has flagged a security concern, he said, flipping through the passport pages. Alicia stiffened. That's impossible. Harris stepped forward. We received an anonymous report that a passenger matching your description was behaving suspiciously. We need to confirm you are who you say you are. Alicia's patience snapped. I walked into this airport. I followed every security procedure. And now you're telling me I've been reported for being suspicious. Neither officer responded. Alicia took a slow breath, willing herself to stay composed. Let me be very clear. If this is some mix-up, fix it. If this is an attempt to delay me, know that you're making a serious mistake. The male officer cleared his throat. Mistake or not, you're going to need to comply. Harris reached toward her. Remove your coat and scarf. Alicia recoiled slightly. Excuse me? Standard procedure, Harris said flatly. Alicia narrowed her eyes. Standard for whom? Harris's face remained neutral. Ma'am, if you refuse, we will have to escalate this. Alicia swallowed her anger. She unbuttoned her coat, shrugging it off. She removed her scarf, placing both neatly on the table. Happy? She asked. Harris didn't answer. Instead, she gestured toward Alicia's shoes. Alicia took a step back. This is absurd. You can either comply or miss your flight, the male officer said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Alicia held his gaze for a long moment, then slowly slipped off her heels. They were trying to break her. She wouldn't let them. Alicia stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, her coat and scarf neatly folded on the table beside her. Harris remained expressionless, while the male officer whose name she still didn't know seemed to enjoy this moment a little too much. Arms out, Harris instructed. Alicia complied, her fingers tightening into fists as Harris methodically ran her hands over her arms and torso. The touch was professional, but the situation was anything but. This isn't just security, Alicia said evenly. This is humiliation. Harris didn't respond, continuing the pat-down with the detached efficiency of someone accustomed to ignoring complaints. The male officer chuckled. Ma'am, if you have nothing to hide, this shouldn't bother you. Alicia turned her head sharply toward him. I have nothing to hide, but I do have a flight to catch, and I'd like to know why I'm still being held here. Harris stepped back, nodding. She's clear. Alicia reached for her coat, but the male officer placed his hand on it first. Not so fast. We're still waiting on final verification. Alicia inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stay composed. My passport, my ticket, my identity, what exactly do you need to verify? He smirked. Just being thorough. Alicia had dealt with men like him before. Men who enjoyed exerting power over others just to see them squirm. But she refused to give him that satisfaction. You must be very good at your job, she said smoothly, keeping airports safe from businesswomen with perfume and scarves. His smirk faded. Watch your tone. Alicia smiled. Or what? You'll find another excuse to hold me longer. The door behind them opened abruptly, and a new figure entered as supervisor, judging by his uniform and badge. He was older, with graying hair and a tense expression. What's going on here? He asked, glancing between them. Harris straightened. Routine security check, sir. How long has she been here? About 30 minutes, the male officer answered. The supervisor frowned. And has anything been found? No, sir, Harris admitted. The supervisor exhaled through his nose, clearly displeased. He turned to Alicia. Apologies for the delay, ma'am. We just need to run a final identity check, and then you'll be free to go. Alicia folded her arms. I'd like my passport back while you do that. The supervisor hesitated before nodding. I'll see what I can do. He left the room, and for a brief moment, silence settled between them. Alicia could hear the faint chatter of airport announcements beyond the walls. Then, the male officer spoke again. You sure you don't want to just reschedule your flight? Might be easier. Alicia met his gaze, her patience worn thin. You'd love that, wouldn't you? His smirk returned. Not my problem if you miss it. Alicia checked the clock on the wall. 20 minutes left. She wasn't going to let them win. Alicia's pulse was steady, but her patience was razor thin. She stood in the center of the sterile security room, arms folded, eyes locked on the male officer who seemed to relish her frustration. She checked the clock again. 17 minutes left. The supervisor had promised to retrieve her passport, but she had yet to see it. The male officer leaned casually against the wall. You seem tense. Nervous about something? Alicia inhaled deeply. I'm impatient. There's a difference. He grinned. I'd be nervous too if my identity check was taking this long. She knew what he was doing, trying to provoke her, to make her snap, to justify keeping her here longer. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Just then the door opened, and the supervisor returned. In his hand was Alicia's passport. But instead of relief, Alicia's instincts told her something was wrong. His face was strained. He cleared his throat. Ms. Carter, there's been a complication. Alicia tensed. What complication? The supervisor hesitated, then handed her a printed document. Alicia scanned it quickly. Her name, her flight details, and a note saying her boarding clearance had been revoked. She looked up sharply. What is this? The supervisor sighed. There's been an anonymous report about your behavior. Alicia's jaw tightened. What behavior? The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. A claim that you were acting suspiciously while waiting in line. We have to take all reports seriously. Alicia's stomach twisted. Anonymous report. Suspicious behavior. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a deliberate act of sabotage. I was standing in line like everyone else, she said, her voice controlled but sharp. Who reported me? We can't disclose that information. Alicia's nostrils flared. Of course you can't. The male officer chuckled under his breath. Alicia turned to him. You think this is funny? He shrugged. I think you're making a big deal out of nothing. Just book another flight. She turned back to the supervisor. This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to someone higher up. The supervisor sighed. I am higher up. Then fix it, Alicia said. Now. He hesitated. Alicia stepped closer, lowering her voice. I'm not some lost tourist. I know my rights. Either you reinstate my boarding clearance, or I make one phone call and have someone do it for you. Something flickered in his expression, hesitation, uncertainty. The male officer scoffed. Oh yeah? Who are you going to call? Alicia's eyes remained on the supervisor. Someone who can end this conversation very quickly. The supervisor studied her for a moment, then exhaled. Wait here. He turned and walked out, leaving Alicia alone with Harris and the smug officer. The room was silent except for the distant echo of airport announcements. Alicia rolled her shoulders, steadying herself. 12 minutes left. The male officer clicked his tongue. You're awfully confident. Alicia met his gaze, calm but unwavering. I've dealt with men like you before. You push just hard enough to see if someone will break. But here's the thing, you picked the wrong woman. His smirk faltered just slightly. For the first time, Alicia felt the shift. They thought they were in control. They were wrong. Alicia's mind was a ticking clock, each second draining the time she had left to board her flight. 10 minutes. The security room was suffocating, a space designed to break resolve. But Alicia wasn't someone who broke easily. The male officer still leaned against the wall, watching her with amusement. Harris stood stiffly, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The door remained shut. No sign of the supervisor. No sign of her boarding clearance being reinstated. Alicia had waited long enough. She pulled out her phone. Harris immediately took a step forward. You're not allowed to use that in here. Alicia raised an eyebrow, but didn't pause. She scrolled through her contacts, pressed one number, and brought the phone to her ear. The male officer chuckled. Who are you calling? Your lawyer. Alicia didn't answer. The line rang once before a deep voice picked up. Alicia? She exhaled, relief and frustration mixing. They're holding me? A pause. Then, where? JFK Airport. Private security room. No legitimate reason. A sharp inhale on the other end. Then a simple response. Give them the phone. Alicia turned to Harris, her expression cool. He wants to speak with you. Harris hesitated. Who is this? Take the phone and find out. Harris glanced at the male officer, who shrugged. Finally, she took the phone, bringing it to her ear. Hello, this is Officer Harris. She didn't get to finish. Her spine straightened instantly, her face shifting from neutral to pale. Sir, I know, of course not. Yes. Yes, I understand. The male officer frowned. Who is it? Harris ignored him, listening intently. A bead of sweat formed at her temple. Then, without another word, she handed the phone back to Alicia. Alicia pressed it to her ear. Handled. Give it 30 seconds. Alicia smirked. Appreciate it. She ended the call and tucked the phone away. The room was silent. The male officer was no longer smirking. What the hell was that? Before Alicia could answer, the door burst open. The supervisor rushed in, his face a mixture of fear and urgency. Behind him, a higher-ranking airport official trailed closely, looking equally unsettled. Ms. Carter, the official said quickly, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Alicia folded her arms. That so? The supervisor swallowed. Yes. You are, of course, free to board your flight immediately. We deeply regret the inconvenience. Alicia didn't move. I want my passport and ticket back. The official nodded furiously, motioning for the supervisor, who scrambled to hand over her documents. Alicia took them, inspecting her passport before tucking it safely away. Is there anything else we can do to? Alicia held up a hand, silencing him. She turned to Harris. You. Walk me to my gate. Harris stiffened. The official nodded at her urgently. Do it. Alicia strode toward the door, her composure unwavering. Harris followed. The male officer remained frozen, watching Alicia leave with a clenched jaw. He had no idea what had just happened, but he knew one thing. He had picked the wrong woman. Harris walked slightly behind Alicia, her posture stiff, her silence telling. The tension between them stretched like an invisible rope, pulling tighter with every step toward the gate. The bustling sounds of the airport grew louder as they exited the security corridor. The sterile isolation of the security room had been suffocating, but here, under the bright lights and murmuring voices of travelers, Alicia was back in control. Alicia adjusted the strap of her handbag and glanced at Harris. How often do you do that? Harris didn't respond immediately. Do what? She asked finally, keeping her eyes forward. Single out passengers like me. Harris's step faltered just for a second. Alicia noticed. The security officer inhaled deeply, as if considering her answer. I don't make the rules. Alicia let out a dry laugh. That's the easiest excuse in history. Silence. They passed a row of seating areas, where travelers scrolled on their phones, sipped coffee, or chatted with companions. Normal passengers, enjoying a normal airport experience. Alicia should have been one of them. Instead, she had been humiliated, stripped of dignity, and treated like a suspect for simply existing. She glanced at the clock. 7 minutes until boarding closed. Harris cleared her throat. Look, it wasn't personal. Alicia stopped walking. Harris did too. Alicia turned slowly, tilting her head. Not personal? Harris shifted on her feet, avoiding her gaze. You searched my belongings like I was a criminal, Alicia continued. You forced me into a room, made me strip down, and acted like it was just routine. And when I questioned you, you threatened to escalate the situation. Harris exhaled, looking away. Alicia took a step closer. Tell me, Officer Harris, if I had been a white woman in yoga pants and a ponytail, would we be having this conversation? Harris's lips parted, as if to respond, but no words came out. Because they both knew the answer. Alicia didn't wait for an excuse. She turned and resumed walking. Harris followed. As they neared the gate, Alicia spotted the boarding line thinning. A flight attendant at the counter glanced up, immediately recognizing the escorted woman approaching. The attendant's eyes widened, and she whispered something to the agent beside her. They knew who Alicia was now. Alicia walked straight up to the counter. The attendant forced a smile. Ms. Carter, we're so sorry for the... Just give me my seat. Alicia interrupted. Of course, ma'am. Right this way. The gate door opened. Alicia took one last glance at Harris. You can go now. The officer looked like she wanted to say something, but thought better of it. She gave a short nod and turned on her heel, walking away quickly, as if wanting to escape the moment. Alicia stepped into the jet bridge. She didn't look back. They weren't worth another second of her time. The hushed murmur of first-class passengers and the scent of freshly brewed coffee greeted Alicia as she stepped onto the plane. The contrast between the sterile, hostile airport security room and the polished luxury of the aircraft was almost laughable. The flight attendant at the entrance straightened immediately, flashing a professional yet nervous smile. Ms. Carter, welcome aboard, she said quickly, gesturing toward the front of the cabin. Your seat is right this way. Alicia said nothing as she walked past, her heels clicking against the carpeted floor. She could still feel the cold linoleum from the security room beneath her feet. The indignity of being searched, questioned, and dismissed as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. They thought they could make her feel small. They were wrong. She reached her seat 1A, first-class window, and set her bag down carefully. She took her time removing her coat, draping it neatly over the seat before sliding into place. A deep exhale. A moment to reset. Then movement caught her eye. A middle-aged man in business attire sat across the aisle, staring at her. His lips were pressed in a thin, disapproving line. Alicia met his gaze. She recognized him instantly. The man from the security line. The one who had bâillé moi and muttered that she was causing trouble. His eyes flicked to her before returning to his newspaper, as if he hadn't been caught. Alicia smirked. She leaned back in her seat as the flight attendant approached with a tray. Would you like a pre-flight drink, Miss Carter? Alicia glanced at the selection. Champagne, wine, or sparkling water. She reached for the champagne. Yes. I think I will. The man across the aisle stiffened slightly, but didn't speak. Good. Let him sit with his discomfort. She sipped the chilled drink as passengers settled in. Overhead compartments clicked shut, murmurs of conversations faded, and the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing final preparations for departure. Then another voice. The same flight attendant from earlier approached, her expression now significantly more tense. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice softer now. "I just wanted to personally apologize for the inconvenience back at the airport." Alicia raised an eyebrow. "Inconvenience?" The attendant swallowed. "I assure you, it does not reflect our airline's values, and we take incidents like this very seriously." Alicia held the woman's gaze for a long moment. Before responding, "I see." She set her champagne glass down carefully. "And tell me, what exactly is your airline planning to do about it?" The attendant faltered. She had expected Alicia to nod politely, to accept the vague corporate apology. Alicia didn't move, didn't blink. The woman cleared her throat. We will be reviewing our security procedures, and that's not my problem," Alicia cut in smoothly. "The way I see it, this wasn't a security issue. It was a respect issue." The attendant paled. "Ms. Carter, I assure you," Alicia tilted her head. "Do you know who I am?" The woman hesitated. Alicia let the silence stretch before answering for her. "I am a board member of this airline," she said, leaning forward slightly. "And I also happen to be the daughter of one of its largest investors." The flight attendant's face drained of color. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper froze mid-page turn. Alicia took another sip of champagne, savoring the cold fizz against her tongue. Then she smiled. "You should really make sure your staff knows who they're dealing with." The flight attendant stumbled over an apology, her words nearly incoherent. "Ms. Carter, I had no idea. Of course you didn't." Alicia waved a dismissive hand. "But you do now." The flight attendant nodded frantically before backing away, nearly bumping into another crew member. Alicia turned her attention to the window, watching as the runway stretched before them. The engines rumbled, and the plane began its slow taxi toward the sky. She had been delayed, humiliated, and underestimated. But in the end, she was exactly where she belonged. And now they all knew it too. The plane ascended smoothly, the ground shrinking below as Alicia stared out the window. The sky stretched endlessly, a vast contrast to the confinement she had endured in that sterile airport room. She let the quiet hum of the engines settle around her, but her mind remained sharp, replaying every moment leading up to this. The scrutiny, the humiliation, the arrogance of those men who thought they held the power. Across the aisle, the man with the newspaper hadn't turned a page since her revelation. His posture was stiff, his face carefully neutral, but his fingers gripped the edges of the paper a little too tightly. Alicia let a smirk tug at the corner of her lips. Good. Let him sit with it. A flight attendant, a different one this time, approached cautiously. "Ms. Carter, may I refresh your drink?" Alicia glanced at her half-full champagne flute. "No, thank you. But I would like something else." The woman nodded. "Of course. What can I bring you?" Alicia leaned back, her voice effortlessly smooth. "The contact information for your airline's head of security." The attendant hesitated, eyes flicking toward the lead stewardess standing at the galley. I'm not sure I can provide that, ma'am." Alicia took her time adjusting the sleeve of her blouse before locking eyes with the attendant. "I think you can." The woman swallowed. "I'll check for you." She hurried away, disappearing behind the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin. Alicia glanced at the time. 4 hours until landing. 4 hours until she walked off this plane and decided just how much damage she was willing to inflict. Because this wasn't over. Far from it. The man across the aisle cleared his throat. Alicia turned her gaze toward him slowly, expectantly. He shifted uncomfortably. That was quite the scene back there. Alicia raised an eyebrow. "Which part?" He exhaled sharply through his nose, as if debating whether or not to continue. "You have to understand, airport security is tight for a reason. They were just doing their jobs." Alicia let out a quiet laugh. "Were they?" He pursed his lips. "You don't think so?" I know so. She held his gaze, steady and unwavering. Tell me, how long did it take for you to get through security? The man hesitated. A few minutes. Alicia tilted her head slightly. And how long do you think? I was detained? He didn't answer. She continued, voice calm but cutting. How many times has an officer flipped through your wallet, questioning how you could afford the things you own? How many times have you been led to a back room, stripped of your coat, your shoes, your dignity because of an anonymous report? He swallowed, shifting in his seat. Alicia gave a small, humorless smile. Exactly. The silence stretched between them, heavier than the plane itself. The flight attendant returned, standing a little too straight, a slip of paper held tightly in her hands. Ms. Carter, I was able to retrieve this for you. She handed over the note. Alicia took it, unfolding it carefully. A direct line to the airline's head of security, along with an internal email. Thank you, Alicia said simply. The woman hesitated. If there's anything else, that will be all. The attendant gave a quick nod and hurried away. Alicia folded the paper and slipped it into her handbag. The game had changed. She hadn't just won. She was about to rewrite the rules. The weight of the paper in Alicia's handbag felt heavier than it should. A name, a number, and an email address, a direct line to the people responsible for the disaster that had unfolded back at JFK. She had the power to let it go. She wouldn't. She unfastened the clasp of her bag and pulled out her phone, slipping on her noise-canceling earbuds. The plane's Wi-Fi connected instantly, and within moments, she was composing an email. Subject: Immediate attention required. Incident at JFK Airport to Head of Airline Security, Mr. Langley. My name is Alicia Carter. I am a board member of this airline, as well as the daughter of one of its largest investors. Earlier today, I was subjected to unwarranted, discriminatory treatment at JFK Airport, including unlawful detainment, the confiscation of my passport, and baseless accusations that led to an indefinite delay of my flight. I expect a formal report detailing why this happened, who was responsible, and what actions will be taken to ensure this never happens again, not just to me, but to anyone. I suggest you respond promptly. Otherwise, I'll take my concerns to the board of directors. Sincerely, Alicia Carter, she read the email once, twice. Then she hit send. It took less than 5 minutes for a response to appear in her inbox. Ms. Carter, I assure you that we take this matter extremely seriously. We were unaware of your treatment at JFK, and I will personally conduct an internal review. Please allow me some time to gather information, and I will report back to you shortly. Sincerely, James Langley, Head of Security. Airline name, Alicia smirked. He was scrambling. Good. She closed her phone and exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders back against the seat. The man across the aisle was pretending not to watch her, his eyes flicking back to his newspaper whenever she moved. She let him stew in his discomfort. A flight attendant appeared again, this time looking more nervous than before. Ms. Carter, she said carefully, the captain has requested a moment of your time once we land. Alicia arched an eyebrow. The captain? The attendant nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. He was informed of the situation, and he'd like to personally ensure your experience with our airline is handled appropriately. Alicia let a pause stretch. Then she smiled. How thoughtful. The attendant swallowed. Would you like me to arrange a private meeting room upon arrival? Alicia considered it. No. I'll meet him at the gate. Understood, Ms. Carter. The woman practically bowed before retreating. The moment the attendant was gone, the man across the aisle finally spoke again. You must be very important, he muttered, a sharp edge to his tone. Alicia took a slow sip of water before answering. I am. He scoffed, shaking his head. People like you always play the victim. Alicia let out a cold laugh. People like me? She echoed. His jaw tightened. You know what I mean? Alicia studied him for a long, moment. Then, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough. "You're afraid," she said simply. His head snapped up. "Excuse me? You're afraid because people like me," she gestured between them, "are no longer staying silent." His face flushed. Alicia leaned back, a satisfied smirk curling at the edges of her lips. The plane was beginning its descent now, the skyline of her destination coming into view. They had tried to stop her from getting here. They had failed. And soon, they'd realize just how badly. The aircraft descended smoothly, the city skyline stretching across the horizon as Alicia watched from her window. They had tried to stop her from reaching this moment. They had underestimated her. Now, she was about to show them the cost of that mistake. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. On behalf of the crew, we thank you for flying with us today." There was a brief pause. Then something unusual. "And to our first-class passenger, Ms. Alicia Carter, we sincerely regret the treatment you experienced earlier. We look forward to addressing the matter properly upon landing." Alicia's lips curled slightly. So they were making it public now. Good. Across the aisle, the businessman, the same man who had dismissed her, belittled her, stiffened. His face flushed as he hunched deeper into his seat. He had witnessed her battle from afar, assuming she would lose. Now he was watching her win. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, rolling smoothly along the runway. Alicia took her time collecting her things, fastening her coat over her shoulders as the aircraft taxied to the gate. The moment they reached the terminal, a flight attendant appeared at her side. "Ms. Carter, the captain is waiting for you just outside." Alicia nodded. "I'll be there in a moment." She stood slowly, feeling every eye in first class shift toward her. Some passengers looked curious, others nervous. And then there was the man across the aisle, who looked as if he wanted to disappear into his seat. Alicia let the moment stretch, then turned to him. "You asked me earlier if I thought they were just doing their jobs," she said evenly. He didn't answer. Alicia smiled a quiet, victorious smile. "I think you have your answer now." Then, without another glance, she stepped into the aisle and walked toward the exit. As soon as she stepped onto the jet bridge, she saw them, a small gathering of airline officials, standing stiffly near the gate entrance. At the center of them stood the captain, an older man with silver hair, his uniform crisp and pressed. His face was composed, but there was undeniable tension in his eyes. Beside him stood James Langley, the airline's head of security. So, they had sent the big names. Alicia approached slowly, heels clicking against the jet bridge floor. "Ms. Carter," the captain greeted, his voice careful. "We'd like to formally apologize for what happened today." Alicia didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of it. Then, she turned to Langley. "I assume you've already reviewed the details of what happened." Langley cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. And I assure you we take this very seriously." Alicia tilted her head slightly. "Good. Then let's talk about what happens next." Langley nodded stiffly. "We are launching a full internal review. Disciplinary action will be taken against the officers involved, and we'll be issuing a public statement regarding the incident." "Not enough," Alicia said smoothly. Langley blinked. "Excuse me?" Alicia's expression didn't waver. "A review? A statement? That's damage control, not accountability." Langley shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Carter, if there's something else you'd like to request, there is," Alicia cut in. "I want a meeting with the board of directors. And I want policy changes implemented, not just an apology, not just firings. Structural changes." Langley hesitated. The captain looked at him, then back at Alicia. "That can be arranged." Alicia held their gaze, assessing them. They weren't agreeing because they wanted to. They were agreeing because they had no other choice. "Good," she finally said. Langley exhaled. "We'll coordinate with your office to schedule the meeting. In the meantime, Please allow us to arrange for private transport to your hotel as a further courtesy." Alicia smiled, but there was a sharpness to it. "Don't mistake this for me being satisfied, Mr. Langley," she said. "This isn't over until real change happens. And I'll make sure it does." Langley swallowed, nodding stiffly. Alicia turned away, stepping past them without another word. Outside, the city stretched before her, bright, alive, full of possibility. She breathed in deeply, letting the crisp air wash over her. They had tried to humiliate her, delay her, break her. Instead, they had handed her the leverage to change the system. Alicia Carter had arrived, and the world was about to know it. Alicia Carter didn't just walk away from that experience, she walked into something bigger. In the weeks that followed, her story sent ripples through the industry. Headlines covered the unjust treatment she had faced, and soon, airports and airlines were forced to answer tough questions. The meeting with the board of directors happened, not because they wanted it to, but because Alicia had made it impossible for them to ignore her. Policies changed. Accountability was enforced. And most importantly, people were watching. Because stories like Alicia's weren't just her own. They belonged to countless others who had faced the same injustice, but had never been given the chance to fight back. But now, things were different. Where are you watching from? This story is just one example of the challenges people face every day. Discrimination, injustice, power struggles, these aren't just stories. They're reality. What do you think? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this? Let us know in the comments. And where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. We'd love to know how far this message is reaching. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful, thought-provoking content, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. More stories are coming, and you won't want to miss them.